High above your head right now, faster than a race car on a highway, an invisible river of air is racing around the planet. It has always been there. For almost the entire history of human flight, absolutely nobody knew it existed, because nobody had ever found a way to actually look. Here is how strange that river is. Barely 10 kilometers up, winds can blow steadily at over 200 miles an hour, faster than almost any storm ever recorded at ground level. Yet on the ground below, the air can be perfectly calm, leaves barely stirring on the trees. Early aviators in the 1920s and 1930s occasionally felt hints of it. A headwind that seemed to come from nowhere, a tailwind too strong to explain. But with no instruments capable of tracking wind at those altitudes systematically, every account stayed a rumor. A pilot's strange story nobody could confirm. Commercial and military aviation was, at that very moment, pushing higher and faster than ever before. New engines, pressurized cabins on the horizon, pilots reaching for altitudes nobody had sustained for long. Nobody yet suspected that the sky itself, at those heights, played by an entirely different set of rules. In 1933, American aviator Wiley Post, flying solo around the world at high altitude in a pressurized suit, noticed something his instruments couldn't explain. His ground speed sometimes far exceeded his airspeed, as if some enormous unseen hand were pushing his plane forward from behind. Post's odd readings were treated as a curiosity, not a discovery, one pilot's story, filed away without a real explanation. What the mystery actually needed wasn't one more anecdote. It needed years of patient, systematic measurement, taken by someone willing to track the sky itself, one balloon at a time. That someone was already at work, years earlier, on the other side of the Pacific. His name was Wasaburo Oishi, a Japanese meteorologist born in 1874. A patient, methodical scientist who had already decided that the real answer to the sky's mysteries lived at the altitudes nobody had bothered to measure. In 1920, Japan's Central Meteorological Observatory established a dedicated aerological station at Tateno, northeast of Tokyo, a facility built specifically to study the atmosphere far above the ground. Nishi took charge of it and began the kind of observation program almost nobody else in the world was running. His method was almost absurdly simple: release a small hydrogen-filled balloon, let it climb at a known, steady rate, and track it from the ground with a theodolite, a precision surveying instrument, recording its changing angle every few seconds as it rose higher and higher into the sky. From those changing angles and simple geometry, Ishi's team could calculate exactly how far the balloon had drifted sideways at every altitude it passed through, and therefore, indirectly, exactly how hard and in which direction the wind was blowing, layer by layer, all the way up. Between 1923 and 1925 alone, Oishi Station carried out nearly 1,300 separate balloon observations, an extraordinary volume of patient, repetitive fieldwork, launch after launch in every season, methodically building the very first detailed picture of wind at altitude anywhere in the world. And the data revealed something nobody expected. At roughly 9 to 12 kilometers up, a narrow, ferocious, remarkably steady wind blew almost constantly from west to east, sometimes exceeding 200 kilometers an hour, more than twice the strength of anything meteorologists assumed existed at that height. This wasn't a passing storm or a one-off gust his instruments had mistaken. It repeated, launch after launch, season after season, a persistent, structured current of air, confined to a narrow altitude band, entirely unlike the gentle, gradually increasing winds textbooks of the time assumed governed the upper atmosphere. It is hard to overstate how significant this finding actually was. An entire, previously unknown feature of Earth's atmosphere, powerful enough to move weather systems, strong enough to matter for any future aircraft flying that high. Discovered quietly, patiently, at a modest observatory most of the world had never heard of. Wasaburo Oishi, though, was not only a meteorologist. He was also a committed internationalist. For years, the president of the Japan Esperanto Society, devoted to a language invented specifically to help humanity communicate and hopefully quarrel less across borders. Esperanto had been invented in the late 1880s by L.L. Zamenhof, a Polish-Jewish ophthalmologist who grew up amid ethnic tension in his hometown and dreamed of a neutral, easy-to-learn second language that could belong to no single nation, a genuine, idealistic project for world peace through communication. By the 1920s, Esperanto had real international momentum, societies, congresses, and journals across dozens of countries, and Oishi, as a true believer in its mission, made a fateful choice. He would publish his observatory's official findings not in Japanese and not in English, but in Esperanto. In 1926, Tateno Observatory's official annual report appeared entirely in Esperanto, describing, for the first time anywhere in scientific print, the ferocious high-altitude current Oishi had spent years patiently measuring. It was, quietly, one of the most consequential meteorological documents of the 20th century. It was a genuine gamble, made in good faith. A universal language, Oishi hoped, deserved universal scientific use. Proof, in its own small way, that science could rise above national languages entirely. Between 1926 and 1944, he would go on to publish 19 such reports, nearly 50 pages, all in Esperanto. But the world's working meteorologists in London, Berlin, Washington, Paris simply did not read Esperanto. The reports arrived, if they arrived at all, in a language treated as a curiosity rather than a scientific medium. And so, astonishingly, the discovery of the jet stream sat almost entirely ignored. Oishi kept going regardless. Season after season, balloon after balloon, because for him this was never really about recognition. It was about the data itself and about proving, in practice, that a shared invented language could carry real, serious science across every border on Earth. His growing dataset showed the current was strongest in winter and weaker in summer, consistently anchored right around the tropopause, the boundary, roughly 9 to 12 kilometers up, where Earth's weather-bearing troposphere gives way to the calmer stratosphere above it. Here's that vertical structure as a real computed figure, wind speed plotted against altitude. Near the ground, the air barely stirs. Climbing higher, speed builds steadily. Then, right around the tropopause, it spikes sharply before easing off again into the calmer stratosphere above. Elsewhere, without knowing anything of Shishi's work, other scientists were circling the very same phenomenon from different angles entirely. In 1939, German meteorologist Heinrich Seelkopf coined a new scientific term for a fast-flowing, high-altitude current he'd identified independently, Strahlströmung, literally, jet-like flow. Seelkopf had no idea Shishi's data existed. Shishi, publishing quietly in Esperanto, had no idea a German meteorologist had just coined a catchy new term for the same phenomenon. Two independent scientific vocabularies, describing one identical current growing up in total isolation from each other. Three independent threads. Wiley posts odd instrument readings, Shishi's 13 years of Esperanto published data, and Seelkopf's freshly coined German terminology sat scattered across the world in 1939, each one only a partial piece, none of them yet recognized as describing the exact same global phenomenon. It is a genuinely strange kind of historical near miss, had the international meteorological community simply been able to read Shishi's Esperanto reports. The world might have understood this ferocious, high-altitude current more than a decade before it mattered most, in the skies of an approaching war. Oishi's own motivation, worth sitting with, ran deeper than professional ambition. He had lived through the shockwaves of the First World War and its aftermath, and genuinely believed a shared neutral language might, in some small way, help prevent the next catastrophe by helping nations actually understand each other. Through the 1930s, though, the country he lived in moved in the opposite direction, toward the very militarism and nationalism his internationalist ideals had hoped to guard against. The irony would only deepen. The language of peace and the discovery it carried were about to collide with a world at war. Oishi remained at his post through these years, continuing the meticulous balloon program at Tateno, even as the wider world paid it almost no attention, a scientist patiently measuring an invisible river that, within a few short years, an entire war would be forced to reckon with. Meanwhile, other wartime aircrews kept brushing against the same phenomenon. Ferry pilots flying the North Atlantic route between the United States and Britain routinely logged westerly tailwinds topping 100 miles an hour at altitude, startling readings, radioed in, and then filed away without any larger explanation. Like Wiley Post's readings a decade earlier, these logs were noted, discussed, and then largely set aside. An unusually strong wind on an unusually good night, rather than evidence of a structured, persistent planet-circling current that virtually nobody outside Shishi's small circle had yet properly named or mapped. By 1944, though, the United States was preparing a bombing campaign that would make this invisible river impossible to ignore any longer. The new B-29 Superfortress, pressurized, long-ranged, capable of flying higher than almost any aircraft built before it, was designed for precision daylight bombing from extreme altitude. The doctrine depended on flying above enemy flak and fighters, roughly 9 to 10 kilometers up, while still bombing accurately. A plan built on conventional assumptions about upper atmosphere winds that, unbeknownst to American planners, simply did not hold anywhere near Japan's home islands. On November 24, 1944, the plan was finally put into action, Operation San Antonio I, the first B-29 raid on Tokyo itself, targeting the Musashino aircraft factory, a mission meant to prove that high-altitude precision bombing could reach the heart of the Japanese war machine. Roughly 111 B-29s took off that day. Mechanical trouble forced 17 to turn back before ever reaching Japan, and thick cloud cover meant only a couple dozen aircraft actually located and bombed the intended target. A rough start, and the winds hadn't even been the main problem yet. Then, approaching the target at altitude, crews felt something no briefing had prepared them for. Their airspeed indicators read a perfectly normal 200 miles an hour, yet their actual progress across the ground had all but stopped. Some crews watched the Japanese coastline crawl slowly closer on radar, hang motionless for what felt like an eternity, and then, astonishingly, begin to recede again, even with engines at full power pointed directly at the target. Pilots would later describe it as having a genuinely negative ground speed. Bombs released from that altitude, aimed with careful calculation for calm or gentle winds, instead sailed wildly off course, carried sideways by a current stronger than anything any bombardier's targeting table had ever been built to correct for. Damage to the Musashino plant that day was, by most accounts, disappointingly light. Crews returning that day reported something else too, fuel gauges reading far lower than the mission plan expected. The cost, it would soon become clear, of fighting a headwind stronger than any American meteorologist had thought possible at that altitude, over that stretch of ocean. It happened again on the next mission. And the next. Not a single freak event, but a repeating, predictable, maddening pattern. Every high-altitude approach toward Japan seemed to run straight into the same ferocious current, blowing steadily from west to east, exactly where Oishi had charted it 2 decades earlier. American meteorologists attached to the campaign began systematically logging the readings, and the numbers were staggering. Sustained winds at bombing altitude, sometimes exceeding 230 miles an hour, genuinely among the strongest winds ever reliably measured anywhere on Earth, calm skies or storm alike. Here's that same vertical wind structure once more, as a real computed figure, and this time with the actual historical measurements marked directly on it, Oishi's 1920s balloon data, and the ferocious winds American B-29 crews clocked over Japan in November 1944, both landing on the identical curve. For American commanders, this wasn't an academic curiosity, it was a direct threat to the entire high-altitude bombing strategy. Precision daylight raids from 9 to 10 kilometers up depended on winds behaving in roughly predictable ways. Instead, an unpredictable, near-hurricane-force current was routinely wrecking accuracy and burning irreplaceable fuel. By March 1945, General Curtis LeMay made a dramatic tactical shift, abandoning high-altitude daylight precision bombing in favor of low-altitude nighttime incendiary raids instead. The decision had several causes, but the punishing, unreliable winds at altitude and their damage to bombing accuracy were genuinely among them. It's worth pausing on the strangeness of this moment in history. The exact same atmospheric river Kishi had patiently measured and published in 1926 was now actively shaping how a world war was being fought, 2 decades after the discovery, and a world away from where it had first been made. The phenomenon needed a name that would actually stick in English, and it got one quickly. American meteorologists and airmen began calling it, simply and vividly, the jet stream. A description so intuitive it needed no further explanation to anyone who had felt its force firsthand. Veteran air crews who lived through it described this sensation in strikingly consistent terms. Not turbulence, not a storm, but something closer to riding, or fighting. An enormous, invisible, impossibly fast current, a phantom river running directly through the sky they thought they knew. Here's the deeper irony, though. And it cuts the other way entirely. While American crews were discovering this river by brute, expensive trial and error, the Japanese military had already quietly begun consulting the very same phenomenon, using Oishi's own decades-old data, for a project of its own. In late 1943, before a single American crew had felt the jet stream's force, the Imperial Japanese Army had already tasked meteorologist Hidetoshi Arakawa of Japan's Central Meteorological Observatory with a very specific question: how far and how fast could something ride that current all the way to North America? Arakawa turned directly to Oishi's long-buried Esperanto reports, the same data the rest of the world had ignored for nearly 2 decades, and used them to calculate that a payload released into the winter jet stream at 9 to 11 kilometers could cross the Pacific in 30 to 100 hours. It is a genuinely uncomfortable historical fact, and worth stating plainly. The very discovery born from one idealist dream of peaceful, universal scientific communication was about to be repurposed as the guidance system for one of the strangest weapons of the entire Second World War. By late 1944, with American bombing raids intensifying and few other ways to strike the American mainland directly, Japan committed to an audacious plan, launched thousands of unmanned balloons carrying incendiary and anti-personnel bombs, and let the jet stream itself carry them across the Pacific Ocean. The weapon was codenamed Fugo. Each balloon's envelope, roughly 10 meters across, was built from layers of paper laminated with a konjac plant paste adhesive. Remarkably strong for its weight and cheap enough to mass-produce by the thousands during a war already straining Japan's industrial resources. The genuinely clever part was altitude control. An onboard barometric device automatically released sandbag ballast whenever the balloon dipped below its target altitude band, keeping it riding steadily inside the jet stream's fastest layer for the multi-day crossing, entirely without a pilot or any radio guidance. Between November 1944 and April 1945, Japan launched roughly 9,300 of these balloons from coastal sites on Honshu, an enormous, sustained effort, each one released individually into the jet stream and left to drift, entirely unguided, toward a continent 6,000 miles away. Most were never found. Some fell harmlessly into the ocean, others drifted off course into remote wilderness. But roughly 300 are confirmed to have reached North America, landing across a huge stretch of the continent from Alaska down through the western United States and into Mexico. American authorities, alarmed at the discovery of live ordnance falling from the sky with no obvious source, imposed a strict wartime press blackout, hoping to deny Japan any confirmation its strange weapon was actually working and to prevent public panic over an enemy attack nobody could see coming. That silence, however well-intentioned, would carry a real and tragic cost, because it meant the American public, including people living in the exact rural areas where balloons kept quietly landing, had no idea a genuine, live threat was drifting down out of ordinary afternoon skies. On May 5, 1945, in the forested hills near Bly, Oregon, Reverend Archie Mitchell and his pregnant wife Elsie took 5 children from their church group on a picnic, an entirely ordinary spring outing in a place that felt impossibly far from any battlefield. While Archie parked the car, Elsie and the children discovered something strange half buried in the underbrush, a large deflated balloon and a metal device tangled among the trees. Curious, someone reached out and touched it. The bomb it carried detonated instantly. Elsie Mitchell and 4 of the children, Edward Engine, Jay Gifford, Dick Patsky, and Sherman Shoemaker, were killed instantly. A 5th child, Joan Patsky, died of her injuries shortly after. They remain, to this day, the only deaths from enemy action on the American mainland during the entire war. It is a devastating fact we're sitting with, plainly. The same invisible river of wind that one idealistic scientist had hoped might one day be understood by all of humanity, in a shared language built for peace, had ultimately carried a weapon that took 6 ordinary lives in an Oregon forest. In the aftermath, the U.S. government finally lifted its press blackout, warning rural communities across the West about the balloons and urging anyone who encountered one not to touch it, a policy shift that likely prevented further casualties in the war's final months. Militarily, the Fug Go campaign fell well short of Japan's hopes. Damp seasonal conditions across much of the American West meant the incendiary bombs largely failed to ignite the large-scale forest fires the program's planners had intended, and the balloons caused only scattered, isolated damage overall. Even so, the Fugo program stands as a genuinely remarkable historical footnote, the first weapon in history to use the jet stream deliberately, intentionally, as its actual delivery mechanism, built entirely from paper, hydrogen, and a scientist's 2-decade-old largely ignored meteorological data. Wasaburo Oishi himself, largely unaware of just how directly his data had been used, continued his meteorological career through the war's final years. He lived until 1950, long enough to witness the post-war rebuilding of the same scientific institutions his patient balloon program had once quietly served. Real, formal international credit for Chishi's discovery would only arrive decades later, as historians of science and meteorology went back through the record and recognized what his 1926 Esperanto reports had actually contained, the first documented scientific proof of the jet stream, published nearly 20 years ahead of the war that made it famous. It's a genuinely rare kind of story in the history of science, a real, correct, world-changing discovery made years ahead of everyone else, derailed not by bad data, not by flawed reasoning, but by an entirely well-intentioned choice about which language to publish it in. Meanwhile, back in the war's final months, American meteorologists kept refining their understanding of the newly confirmed jet stream, mapping its seasonal shifts, its typical altitude band, and its startling strength, information that would prove valuable for aviation and forecasting for decades afterward. By the war's end in August 1945, the jet stream had gone, within less than a year, from an obscure academic curiosity to a phenomenon that had shaped bombing strategy, inspired an entire unconventional weapons program, and claimed real human lives on 2 different continents. What the story still lacked, though, was a rigorous physical explanation, not just proof the jet stream existed, and not just a name for it, but an actual theory of why it forms, why it meanders the way it does, and how it connects to the ordinary weather people feel at ground level. That theoretical foundation came from a scientist who had, remarkably, already laid essential groundwork years before the war, Swedish-American meteorologist Carl-Gustaf Rossby, born in Stockholm in 1898, trained under the pioneering Bergen School of Meteorology in Norway before emigrating to the United States. Rossby built his career at the U.S. Weather Bureau, then MIT, then the University of Chicago, steadily developing a mathematical understanding of how Earth's rotation shapes the enormous, slow-moving wave patterns that organize the entire mid-latitude atmosphere, patterns the jet stream turned out to be riding directly inside. In a landmark 1939 paper, Rossby explained the large-scale, slow, meandering waves that snake north and south through the mid-latitude westerlies, the very patterns that would come to be named in his honor Rossby waves, and showed exactly how Earth's rotation and vorticity conservation produce them. Here's the piece that ties it all together. The jet stream doesn't blow in a straight line around the globe. It meanders, bulging poleward into broad ridges, dipping equatorward into deep troughs, and those meanders are themselves Rossby waves, steering the exact storm systems people feel on the ground. A ridge in the jet stream typically brings warm, settled, high-pressure weather beneath it. A trough drags cold air equatorward and often trails a storm system behind it. Where the jet's waves sit at any given moment genuinely determines whether your week is calm or genuinely turbulent. Rossby's mathematics gave forecasters something Jishi's raw balloon data alone never could: a genuine predictive theory, one that let meteorologists start to anticipate how the jet stream's meanders would shift days in advance, rather than simply measuring where the current happened to be right now. Between them, an idealistic balloon tracker in Japan and a rigorous wave theorist in America had, without ever meeting, supplied the two halves of the same discovery: proof the jet stream was real, and mathematics explaining why it behaves the extraordinary way that it does. By the 1950s, the jet stream had become a standard, everyday feature of operational weather forecasting worldwide, routinely tracked, mapped, and factored directly into aviation planning, exactly as Rossby's theoretical framework and decades of accumulated wartime measurement had made possible. Today, commercial airlines plan entire long-haul routes around this same invisible river, and the payoff is real. Here's that effect as a real, computed figure: typical flight duration, eastbound with the jet stream compared against westbound fighting straight into it, on the exact same transatlantic route. On a typical New York to London route, riding the jet stream eastbound regularly shades close to an hour off the flight compared with the return leg westbound, fighting the exact same current head-on. A difference. Airlines plan fuel loads and schedules around every single day. In February 2019, an especially powerful jet stream pushed a westbound turn tailwind transatlantic flight to a genuinely record-setting ground speed of over 800 miles an hour. Arriving from Los Angeles to London in just over 5 hours, a stretch of sky Wiley Post could scarcely have imagined riding that fast. Airlines also use jet stream forecasts to actively avoid the worst of it when flying westbound, routing planes slightly north or south of the strongest core to save fuel, proof that Rossby's meandering wave mathematics is doing real practical work in cockpits every single day. Meteorologists today also lean on the jet stream to explain and forecast entire storm systems days in advance, because a trough in the jet's meandering path is very often the exact mechanism that pulls a major storm system into a region or steers it safely away. Revisit that vertical wind profile once more, because it's still the cleanest single image of the whole discovery: near calm at the surface, building steadily with altitude, spiking ferociously right at the tropopause. The exact structure Chishi charted with balloons a century ago, still measured identically by satellites today. There is a genuinely hopeful research frontier attached to this story too, though it comes with real scientific caution. Some climate scientists propose that rapid Arctic warming may be making the jet stream wavier, its Rossby wave meanders growing larger, and weather patterns beneath it lingering longer than they used to. To be clear and honest about where the science actually stands, this wavier jet stream hypothesis is genuinely still debated among atmospheric scientists, with some studies supporting it and others finding the evidence less conclusive. An active, unresolved research question, not yet a settled fact. Revisit the meandering jet stream itself once more, because the shape really is the whole mechanism: broad Rossby wave ridges and troughs snaking around the globe, steering the exact storm tracks and temperature swings that shape ordinary daily weather across the entire mid-latitude world. Trace the whole story back, and it runs through an almost unbelievable set of places: a quiet Japanese observatory releasing balloons at dawn, an invented language meant to unite the world, a B-29 cockpit over Tokyo, an Oregon forest clearing, and a Swedish-American theorist's blackboard in Chicago. None of this understanding came free or easily. It came from one meteorologist's 20 years of unglamorous, repetitive balloon tracking, from air crews who flew straight into a phenomenon nobody had warned them about, and from families in rural Oregon who paid the war's strangest, most invisible cost. The deepest irony of the whole story may be this: an idealist who believed a universal language could help prevent conflict instead handed his discovery, unread for 2 decades, straight into the middle of the very war he'd hoped humanity might have found a way to avoid. And yet the deeper scientific lesson survives the tragedy intact. Real, careful, patient measurement is real regardless of what language, or what country, or what decade it happens to be published in, and eventually, one way or another, the truth about the sky finds a way through. Today, prion research aside, meteorology owes an enormous debt to both halves of this story. Shishi's patient balloons proved the river was real, and Rossby's elegant mathematics explained exactly why it meanders the way it does. Together, the full modern picture of the jet stream. Next time you notice your flight home lands earlier than the flight out, or watch a weather forecaster point to a wavy line snaking across a map of the whole country, you're looking directly at the same invisible river that Wasaburo Oishi spent 2 decades patiently, quietly proving was real. Thanks for being awake and curious with me today. Share this with someone who's ever been told an idea was too strange, too indirect, or published in the wrong language to actually be taken seriously, because sometimes the truth just needs more time to be read. Until next time. Keep looking for the rivers you can't see, because some of the most powerful forces shaping our world have been blowing steadily overhead the entire time, waiting only for someone patient enough, in whatever language, to finally write them down. Stay curious. If this story stuck with you, do 2 quick things. Hit subscribe. Neat Science brings another forgotten story back to life, and there's a whole playlist of them waiting for you right now. And tell me in the comments, which part of this surprised you the most? I read every single one. Your next story is just 1 click away. I'll see you there. End card hole. End card hole. End card hole.